All right, guys. Sean Hannity and Tulsi Gabbard went at it over the issue of Russia and Ukraine last night. Let's go ahead and take a listen, and I'll break it down as we go. It's not a very long clip.
You're not answering. Should we give them the weapons to win the war? If they're doing a great job, everybody acknowledges that. Should we give them all, and Europe too, give them the weapons if they're willing to fight for their country?
So before Tulsi even answers, let me just say we've given them so many weapons, hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons. The only things we haven't done to this point are provide like fighter jets, and even that we're on the brink of doing, or other NATO countries are on the brink of doing. Now, there's a reason why you wouldn't want to give fighter jets, because they would have to take off from Poland, which could be interpreted by Russia as NATO attacking Russia, and then boom, we're in World War III. So everything within reason has been done in terms of giving them weapons, and in fact, I'd argue maybe they went too far, because of course, a lot of the weapons are probably going to the Azov battalion and neo-Nazi militias, which nobody really wants, but we're doing and turning a blind eye to it.
They can't win this war, Sean. This is the real world that we live in. It is not, it's not strategically possible to think that Ukraine is going to beat Russia. If you look at it, and then it also is the question, what does winning look like?
You fear Vladimir Putin.
So on that point, I think Tulsi's largely correct. I think she's largely right. I mean, it's overwhelmingly likely that Russia takes Kyiv eventually, wins the war. They just have a much more powerful military. But I will say there is a little asterisk in the conversation, which is look at like the U.S. and Vietnam, for example. Ultimately, we lost. Vietnam is basically a bunch of landless peasants, and they did an insurgency and they did guerrilla warfare, and over time, eventually, they won. It took a very long time. It was almost like a permanent stalemate on the ground, and there were a lot of, atrocities being committed on a regular basis. So it is possible they do an insurgency. It is possible there's endless guerrilla warfare. It is possible they keep a permanent stalemate in place. But one would think it is overwhelmingly likely that eventually Russia takes Kyiv, Russia effectively takes Ukraine. The question is, what is the political will to do that? Like, is there a political will on the ground, not just among Putin and the government, but among the soldiers, that this is like worth it? And if they feel it is, then yeah, they're likely eventually going to win. But if there really isn't that strong political will, then you could see guerrilla warfare basically winning out.
Saying you fear Vladimir Putin would use a nuke. If he uses a nuke, the radiation fallout will impact NATO countries. That triggers Article 5. Do you believe in Article 5 of the NATO agreement?
I think the most responsible thing that our leaders, the United States, leaders of NATO, Ukraine, and Russia need to do right now is look at what the reality is that we are facing on the ground and the reality that the world is facing, and come together to be able to negotiate an outcome to this.
Okay, Putin doesn't want to negotiate. Clearly doesn't want to negotiate. There's been many attempts at negotiation. So when you see images of dead women and children,
I'm not aware
and when you see
Zelensky
neighborhoods
sitting down
blown
with
out,
Putin yet.
hang on, you not think we should provide them the weapons to defend themselves? I just want to know yes or no.
You're missing my point here, Sean, which is we've got to know what we're trying to accomplish, which is an end to this war. It is.
Yeah, Sean is just like, are you in favor of giving them the weapons they want? Well, the weapons they want would include literally everything. It would include not only fighter jets, it would include, like, nuclear weapons. I mean, I'm sure Ukraine, if they could right now get their hand on a nuke, they would be like, yes. So, should we provide them with fighter jets? No, because that could be interpreted as World War III, because they have to take off from Poland. Should we provide them with nuclear weapons? No, that's probably not a good idea either. So, like, when he says the weapons they want, well, what they want, of course, because they're being attacked, is the entire world to already jump in and start World War III. So should we just give them what they want, full stop? No. They want a no-fly zone. If we do a no-fly zone, that's American troops attacking Russian troops. We're shooting Russian planes out of the sky. That's World War III. We simply cannot do that, Sean. He's trying to be like, I'm Mr. Tough Guy. I'm Mr. Keep It Real. But it's like, the things you're calling for, you have no idea the consequences and ramifications of that. And he's just very flippant about this idea of starting World War III. Whereas Tulsi here, I'll rewind it back a little bit, but it seems like she's being a little bit evasive as opposed to just saying that flat out.
Yeah.
Hang on. You not think we should provide them the weapons to defend themselves? I just want to know yes or no.
You're missing my point here, Sean, which is we've got to know what we're trying to accomplish, which is an end to this war. It is cruel to make the Ukrainian people believe that somehow they are going to win this war by prolonging it, and that's what you're talking about here. It would prolong this war, prolong the suffering, and end up causing more lives lost in the end.
If Vladimir Putin wanted to negotiate, he would have done it a long time ago. He's not willing to.
Okay, so that's fair enough. Like there's a point there, but at the same time, if the options on the table are eventually use negotiation and diplomacy when the time is right, when everybody's ready, or do World War III, which kind of are the options that are in front of us, well then obviously any reasonable person would take the path of eventual negotiation and diplomacy. Now, yeah, right now, does it seem like Putin doesn't have the political will to sit down and negotiate what would be a fair deal? Yeah, I think that's a fair point. But if he stays bogged down in Ukraine for a year, 2 years, 3 years, or however long it takes, and you give them the weapons to defend themselves up until that point, well, that's the best off-ramp. We have to offer an off-ramp at some point. But again, Sean Hannity is just super flippant about this idea of World War III.
And if he wants to use chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, he's got to know that his entire country is going to be blown off the face of the earth. I pray to...
See, okay, now that right there is the entire problem. Sean Hannity seems to think that, like, it is, what, fundamentally impossible for Russia to react to Western attacks? Sean, of course it's possible. If we quote-unquote wipe them off the face of the earth, they immediately launch the nukes on the U.S. How does he not understand this? He really, like, and we saw this when he was talking about a no-fly zone and talking about how we should attack the Russian convoy that's just outside of Kyiv. He was casually saying, like, I don't understand, we should just blow it up and say we didn't do it. It's like, first of all, he would know who did it. Like, it's not an open question. It's the most obvious thing in the world. Who would have the incentive to do that? But second of all, of course that's going to lead to retaliation. That's going to lead to backlash. This guy's so flippant. He acts like nuclear weapons don't exist when, of course, they do exist. So let me go ahead. I want to run this back in a second.
God, we never get to that point. But that's always been a threat.
All right, I want to catch from the beginning again.
You're not answering. Should we give them the weapons to win the war? If they're doing a great job, everybody acknowledges that. Should we give them all, and Europe too, give them the weapons if they're willing to fight for their country?
They can't win this war, Sean. This is the real world that we live in. It is not, it's not strategically possible.
The only area where I think I probably disagree with Tulsi here is I don't know her position on just providing genuinely defensive weapons like small arms. I don't know her position. I don't know if she's totally against that. But, you know, my position on it, as I've told you guys a million times, is I'm fine with providing defensive weapons, small arms, etc. But I would absolutely have attached to that this notion that you have to axe the Azov battalion from the National Guard of Ukraine because they're openly, you know, neo-Nazi. They admit at least 20% of them are neo-Nazi, which means that the reality is probably well over like 50%. So I would have strings attached, and the strings attached would be, yeah, you'll get these arms, but you got to axe the Azov battalion, because unfortunately we're not doing that. So we're giving them all these weapons, and then the Azov battalion being like the most hardened fighters among them, well, you don't want to arm them to the teeth for the same reason you didn't want to arm the Mujahideen in the 1980s, for the same reason you didn't want to arm al-Nusra on the ground in Syria, because you're having the worst hard-right factions with the most fighting experience with a lot of the weapons, and then eventually they could do a coup in the country. So I would definitely have strings attached, and I would say, I'm not giving you the weapons unless and until you axe them. But I don't even know if that's Tulsi's position. I don't know if Tulsi's position is like, give no weapons. That, to me, would not be a good position. But she would have to speak on that, and maybe she has in the past, and I just didn't see it. I actually would be a little surprised if her position was like not even, like, no weapons at all, no defensive weapons at all. But anyway, let's finish this out.
To think that Ukraine is going to beat Russia. If you look at it, and then
so
it
what
also
you're
is the
saying
question,
is
what does winning
you
look
fear
like?
Vladimir
What does winning
Putin.
look like?
You're saying you fear Vladimir Putin would use a nuke. If he uses a nuke, the radiation fallout will impact NATO countries. That triggers Article 5. Do you believe in Article 5 of the NATO agreement?
I think that I think the most responsible thing that our leaders, the United States, leaders of NATO, Ukraine, and Russia need to do right now is look at what the reality is that we are facing on the ground and the reality that the world is facing, and come together to be able to negotiate an outcome to this.
Okay, Putin doesn't want to negotiate. Clearly doesn't want to negotiate. There's been many attempts at negotiation. So when you see images of dead women and children,
I'm not aware
and when you see
Zelensky
neighborhoods
sitting down
blown
with
out,
Putin yet.
hang on, you do not think we should provide them the weapons to defend themselves? I just want to know yes or no.
You're missing my point here, Sean, which is we've got to know what we're trying to accomplish, which is an end to this war. It is cruel to make the Ukrainian people believe that somehow they are going to win this war by prolonging it, and that's what you're talking about here. It would prolong this war, prolong the suffering, and end up causing more lives lost in the end.
If Vladimir Putin wanted to negotiate, he would have done it a long time ago. He's not willing to. And if he wants to use chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, he's got to know that his entire country is going to be blown off the face of the earth. I pray to God we never get to that point, but that's always been a threat.
Yeah, what Hannity is just totally wrong on is he's setting up this dichotomy of, since Putin doesn't want to negotiate, he doesn't want to talk, then our only option is number one, give Ukraine whatever the hell they want, including the fighter jets, which would spark World War III, including a no-fly zone, which would spark World War III, including, heavy weaponry, which would spark World War III. And this notion of he's almost looking for an excuse and a reason for the U.S. to directly get involved and attack Russia, which in his dumb mind, he doesn't understand that we just simply can't do that because then the entire world gets destroyed. That's not hyperbolic. That's actually very straightforward. So that's what he doesn't understand. He thinks he's being like a truth teller here and keeping it real, but he doesn't have the inability to think of the second order, third order, fourth order consequences. Again, my only disagreement with Tulsi would be, it seems like she's evasive even to the idea that we should provide some defensive weapons, some small arms, so that they can fight an insurgency, they can fight a guerrilla war. And that is weird. That I don't understand why she would take that position, why she has that perspective. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she doesn't have that perspective. Maybe she is in favor of the small arms going to them. But certainly nothing that can be interpreted as an act of aggression, nothing that can be interpreted as the U.S. getting directly involved, nothing that would lead to World War III. And of course, like I said 1,000 times, I would only give them even the defensive weapons if the Azov Battalion is actually from the National Guard, and there's a way to track where these weapons are going. Because unfortunately, we have a long track record in the past, the U.S., of arming unsavory actors, to say the least, and then that coming back and biting everybody in the ass. But anyway, interesting back and forth, but ultimately not very productive, because Sean is the aggressive one. Sean is the one who's sort of dominating the debate, and I think this is just standard bullheaded neocon garbage of well, what are we going to do? We have no choice but to give Ukraine everything they want, even things that would spark World War III, and then eventually just do World War III. Sean, if you were in charge, if you had your way, the clock is ticking, and eventually that doomsday clock hits midnight, and we're all fucked. But I'm glad you feel like Mr. Tough Guy and Mr. Smart Guy in the process. That would be the only thing that he would think is positive that comes out of it, because it certainly wouldn't be a good situation for the entire planet.